Good afternoon. This is Media Center Ukraine, Odessa. We continue for today, and now we are going to discuss the problems that at first might seem not that important, but it affects us all. This is environmental issue and the impact of war on soils. This topic has been in discussions since 2014, but with the full-scale invasion, the problem has deteriorated. Now we are having with us Lorina Fedorova, expert in sustainable agriculture, NGO Ekodiya. Can you tell us how the war affects soils? Yes, good afternoon. I am representing NGO Ekodiya, Ekoaction. We encompass scientific circles and ordinary people to protect our environment. With the start of the full-scale invasion of Russia, we have changed the focus, the usual focus of our activity, and we started examining the impact of war on soils. And I'm responsible for the part related to contamination of soils. And at first, this might seem not that topical, but anyway, this is important, and the most obvious thing is mined territories, because we know that the hostilities territories are mined as well as liberated territories. And of course, it is risky to have agricultural activities on those territories. According to the State Emergency Service, agrarians anyway violate the rule of having no activities on this mined or contaminated territories. And unfortunately, these farmers, they got killed because they try to work on the mined territories. The next problem we should discuss is chemical contamination. We should understand that every projectile, every rocket or missile, and any type of such military equipment contains powder that gets into the soil, contaminating it with different types of heavy metals and their solutions and mixtures. And this is very dangerous for our soils. And without proper restoration of soils, it will degrade even quicker than it is happening now, damaging the health of the population living on the territory or consuming foods grown in the contaminated areas. This is very briefly about the main problem, which is related to contamination of Ukrainian soils. Fortunately or unfortunately, we have experience of growing crops on the territories that were affected by the war, starting from 2014. The huge Ukrainian territories were attacked by artillery, by multiple launch rocket systems. There were hostilities there. What is the level of real impact of projectiles, powder, and other materials on the capacity of Ukrainian soils? Of course, every case is individual, and it depends on individual crops. because every plant has its own capacity of absorbing different substances. For example, vegetable crops, they absorb more from soils. And if they are cultivated on the contaminated territories, this pollutant will be absorbed more by vegetables comparing to other crops. That's why they are believed even more toxic for consumption. There are other crops, other plants of technical nature that absorb less of such pollutant or then can tolerate them, and thus such plants are less toxic. But we need to take into account that every land plot affected by war, and here we speak not only about rockets, missiles, craters, but about other impacts, like fortifications and the movement of heavy military equipment that has a negative impact on the health of Ukrainian soils. That's why an individual approach is very important here when it comes to selecting cultivated crops. Unfortunately, there are territories that are so polluted, that are so toxic for human health, that it is not economically feasible, and there is no even technological means or environmental means to restore such soils. And for such territories, we offer to put them in conservation for nature to recover and restore it on its own. What territories do you mean now? And how much time is needed for conservation of these territories, for nature to restore it by itself? Yes, thank you for the question. Now I can share the results of our research. We have studied the situation into communities to prove the negative impact of war on soils. That is community in Kharkiv Oblast and Sartansk community. We use the lab testing and high-resolution satellite imagery to study situations there. Unfortunately, in both cases, in both territorial communities, there are certain land plots that are damaged so heavily that this is impossible to restore these soils. So you've named Sartansk community, and what is the name of the community of Kharkiv Oblast? Vilhivka community. This is just like suburbs of Kharkiv. And Sartansk is near Mariupol. Certainly, yes. Now I understand it. Yeah, so the territory that has been occupied since summer 2014. We started satellite imagery to study the damages in March and April of last year, when there were active hostilities, and even back then the territories were damaged heavily. And we need to understand that the war is ongoing, the front line shifts every day, and new territories are damaged every day. The longer the war is, the more intensive the hostilities are, the most difficult it will be to restore the occupied or attacked territories. And the liberated areas in Kharkiv and Kherson Oblast, there are already these land plots, but the biggest amount of contaminated lands can be observed at the front line. And this is the economic zone of Donbas, where the war started in 2014. And even before hostilities, before 2014, there was a significant environmental burden on this territory. I remember that in 2016, in 2017, in the free territory of Donbass, the French environmental initiative acted, started the quality of water there. The fresh water, the water in shafts. Do you have any new testings of the water? Because I do remember that the problem was there not only water in mines and shafts, but also shelling and the contamination of water by soil, through landslides. Do you have any updated information about the quality of water? I cannot tell you any details about water because my main area of responsibility is soil, but as when it comes to soils, there have been started studies and research to examine the impact on soils from 2014. And we can already state that, for example, when it comes to cadmium, zinc, chrome, copper, the threshold allowed amounts have been significantly increased, for some metals more than in 3 times. And of course, we understand that groundwaters will be also contaminated as a result of hostilities. Thus, and we understand that the chemicals can migrate from surface to groundwaters and also negatively affecting human health. All these problems are interrelated. In summer, before the liberation of Kherson Oblast, of Kharkiv Oblast, and partially Luhansk Oblast, it was said that Ukraine had no access to around of thirds of agricultural lands in Zaporizhzhia, Kharkiv, Kherson Oblasts. Russians somehow planned their attacks to damage the agricultural territories of Ukraine. Is there any forecast in terms of how many of these lands Ukraine will lost, and how much time will be needed for restoring of these soils when it comes to different areas, including Lugansk, Kharkiv Oblast, etc.? I can say that it is very difficult to calculate the precise damages as a result of war. But we can have indirect calculations through the unharvested crops on the territories which are now endangered. As for the future losses and as for the necessity to ensure conservation of these land plots, the situation is different in different areas. And we, of course, need to have a scientific approach to individual cases. But now we can study the experience of other countries who were also affected by hostilities. And I can hear my echo now. And everything's fine on our side. Please continue. And we can study the experience of other countries that were affected by hostilities and to conserve some parts of their territories because of heavy mining and because it was impossible to stay on those territories, namely the experience of France. And this is the experience of France during the First World War. that was quite a while ago. But we can say that in 10, 20 years, they were able to restore most part of their soils. But there are some territories that are still under conservation. So it's like 100 years later, they still have some of the conservation areas. Yes, there were the battles fully damaging agricultural areas, and farmers had just to stop their activities, and only like in 10 or 20 years they were managed to get their territories back for agriculture. But I would like to emphasize that conservation is a temporary decision. We need to constantly monitor the state of the soils. But if there is no improvement, then these lands should remain under conservation, because it is dangerous to grow crops there. You've mentioned studies into communities, and you've also mentioned that we can try to approximately calculate losses of Ukrainians, namely Ukrainian farmers, because of the ongoing hostilities, and because some territories can not be now used for agriculture. Have you done any of such calculations and forecasts? No. And I can only speak about calculations conducted by the Kiev Economic School, the Agricultural Center, as for November 2022. They assess losses at 6.6 billion. And they actually started the whole chain of agricultural activities affected by the war. And these are the latest information we have. Thank you. And as for your projects, what are the aims of these projects, of these activities? What are your tasks and objectives now? Our first task was to understand how the war affected our environment. And after we started that work, we understood that our next goal will be developing a recommendation that we are going to submit to the national government, and recommendations that could be useful for local communities affected directly by the war. And these recommendations are related to environmentally sustainable restoration of the territory, soils, and resources. We cooperate with scientific circles, and we understand now that now we have quite an extensive liberated territories which are not restored at the moment. And there are the cases when farmers even occupy the craters, not waiting for demining, trying actually to plant some crops. Such approach is inefficient even when it comes to environmental approach, because we will not be able to assess the situation generally. But we can see there are no initiatives from the leadership of the country in terms of developing strategy to restore soils. That's why our activities, our recommendations are aimed to unite all central executive authorities, relevant institutions that have been actively studying the contamination of soils now. We would like to unite efforts of all stakeholders to develop a solution and to implement it. Thank you. I have a question from my colleague. Anatoly, who actually arranged this press conference. Good afternoon. My name is Anatoly Kosin, Media Center, Ukraine, Odessa. I have a bit different question. Now, Russians have started the narrative that Ukraine should expect a famine this year because they will not supply their fertilizers. What do you think? Can this impact the restoration of our agricultural territories? Can we do without their fertilizers? Yes. Now the situation at the fertilizers market is quite difficult. And the first market response was the increased prices of fertilizers, especially for small and medium-sized farmers, which tried barely to economically survive the situation. It is very difficult to believe what Russian says, especially when it comes to grain deal, because usually what they say and what they do are quite different things, so I'm not frightened by their statements. But our tradition, our practices of using such fertilizers are quite outdated, and we as an environmental organization study the more environmentally sustainable use of fertilizers, and there are technologies that allow farmers to use fertilizers less and to ensure sustainable development, but having the same volumes of harvest. So the problem is not that we should look for another source of fertilizers. We need to ensure access of our farmers to knowledge how to properly use such fertilizers in a more rational way to ensure the same amount of harvests. Thank you. Thank you for the briefing. Thank you for your time. So as soon as you get some new pieces of information about your studies, we will be more than happy to welcome you here for you to share the activities, share the information about activities of your organization and how to restore Ukrainian soils after our victory. Thank you. Thank you for being with us. We have one more briefing planned for today at 2 p.m. We will have with us the head of the Coordination Humanitarian Headquarters of Odessa Oblast, Alexei Cherney, who will share the results of their activities in February, and who will also tell about the results of Volunteer Landing 2.0 that took place in February this year. Stay tuned.